So you have blue brains, okay? These patients got a huge amount of methylene blue. And then within a certain amount of time, a couple hours most of the time, they had an autopsy performed where their brains were blue. This is not surprising. This is, again, a huge amount of methylene blue that you would never be using in clinical practice. The doses that we typically use, as many of you know that are listening, are much, much lower than that. Most of the studies are around 1 milligram per kilogram. However, there are many more, and the clinical experience that we've had over the last 5 years that show that lower doses of methylene blue, 4, 8, 12, 16 milligrams, can be fantastically effective for mitochondrial optimization, for brain health, for overall inflammation as well. And so the doses that they were using in this study were just absolutely ridiculous when it comes to direct clinical care outside of severe emergencies. Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Smarter Not Harder podcast, your home for 1 cent solutions to $64,000 questions. I'm your host again today. My name is Dr. Scott Sherr, and it's a pleasure to be back with all of you. Today's episode is a special episode. This is my first solo episode for the Smarter Not Harder podcast, and I'm really excited for all of you to be here with me when we take a deep dive into some of the controversies around methylene blue. As many of you know, Transcriptions is the sister for-profit company to Health Optimization Medicine and Practice. Health Optimization Medicine and Practice is a nonprofit organization that sponsors this podcast and has created this podcast for all of you. Our main job is to educate, is to inform, to bring on people of all different spectrums, from health to fitness to lifestyle to PhDs and so much more in between. And of course, a lot of what we do is around the Transcriptions company outside of this podcast. And today what I wanted to do is kind of take a deep dive into what's been going on in the world of methylene blue. Now, many of you have probably followed our work for a long time, understand that methylene blue has become a huge thing over the last several months, basically since January, when people like Joe Rogan and then Mel Gibson and then Joe Rogan again on another podcast. But we also have other people talking about it as well, including Andrew Huberman has been speaking about it. Brian Johnson has been speaking about it. Chris Masterjohn, which we'll talk about today. Paul Saladino, which we'll talk about a little bit today, and many others. And so for a company that's been doing this for 5 years, it was pleasantly surprising, as you can imagine, to have such interest in what we're doing just skyrocket over the last several months. Now, we've been laying the groundwork for this for a long time. As many of you that are listening know, we've been around, and we're the first company that created a commercial product at Transcriptions in 2020, in February 2020, actually, right before the pandemic started. So we have tons of information on our blog, on our website. I've done tons of podcasts on it over the years, on methylene blue and the nuances, et cetera. But I thought what I would do today is talk a little bit about the physiology just to get us on the same page, and then talk about some of the controversies that have happened over the last several months. And this is not unexpected. As something becomes more popular, you're going to get a lot of people out there that are trying to leverage its popularity for their own benefit, even if they have ridiculous things to say sometimes. And that's just natural. That's what's going to happen. And that's totally okay. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And I'm excited about it because I've been responding on social media about it, about various people, which we'll talk about today, and trying to set the record straight as best I can. And that's a fun thing for me to do on some level, because I know that if certain people are talking about it, that means that the popularity of it, that the zeitgeist has now included methylene blue, which I think is so overdue. So to get started, let's just get on the same page first. Methylene blue has been around a long time. It was synthesized back in the 1870s, and it became the first drug registered with RFDA, which is very new at that time, in 1897. The indication for methylene blue at that time was malaria. There was very few antimicrobials around, and methylene blue had this fantastic capacity to be used at very high doses to kill bugs like malaria and others, as well as an antimicrobial from an antifungal perspective, an antiparasitic perspective, and an antimicrobial overall from an antibacterial perspective as well. In 1897, it got the name of being a magic bullet because you could give very high doses of methylene blue and you could kill pathogens, but you wouldn't harm the normal human host. And that was kind of the the major thing that we were looking for at the time, because there really weren't very many antimicrobials available at that point. So between 1897 and about 1950, methylene blue was one of the primary antimicrobials around that was used. And it was used for urinary tract infections, for fungal infections, for bacterial infections, even for viral infections. If you grew up in a developing country, actually, even after the 1950s, methylene blue was still used all the time for these indications because it was quite inexpensive. And there was also something called the methylene blue lollipop. So similar, but different to our troches now. But you would give kids methylene blue lollipops to suck on and help them with throat infections, like viral infections, for example. And it does seem to work very well for this, actually, to this day. So even in that time frame, the 1920s, 1930s, especially during World War II, methylene blue was used prophylactically. And if you were a World War II soldier, you were going to go to the Pacific Theater, like near Japan, you were taking methylene blue prophylactically at that time to prevent from infections, and they had all these songs about methylene blue at the time. So in the 1950s, methylene blue became out of favor as an antimicrobial. And again, this is at high doses of methylene blue, which we'll talk about in a minute, because antimicrobials like penicillin came around. From the 1950s, there was another chapter of methylene blue. That's when the first antipsychotics were actually derived from it. Methylene blue does have a capacity called being a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, which means it breaks down or prevents the breakdown of norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine. This is going to become important because there are people out there that are saying that methylene blue only works because it increases serotonin. And that is completely ridiculous, let's be honest, okay? But it does do this. It does increase norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine. So what does that mean? It's going to increase those neurotransmitters in the brain. And there have been some studies that have shown that because of that, methylene blue has an increase in mood capacity. And that is absolutely the case. It's been studied in small ways in depression, bipolar disorder, and other mental health issues with significant benefit overall. And there are other neurologic things that we'll talk about later where methylene blue is helping, probably from a neurotransmitter perspective to a small degree, but a bigger degree from its mitochondrial optimization piece. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. So the first antipsychotics were derived from methylene blue, the first one called chlorpromazine. And from there, methylene blue became a laboratory stain. So if you were using stains in your lab in chemistry class, like me when I was in college at UCLA, you would use methylene blue to stain the cell. And really what it was doing was concentrating in a part of the cell called the mitochondria. And that's where this story gets very exciting. And that's where the story intertwines or starts becoming more of the transcription story too, because Dr. Ted Ochocoso is the founder of Transcriptions. He's the founder of Home Hope. He is sometimes a host on the podcast for our very, very special guests as well, like our PhDs and Nobel laureates and things like that. He was doing research back in the mid-2010s before we started Transcriptions and when Home Hope was just getting started. And he was seeing all this amazing research that was happening because methylene blue concentrates in the mitochondria. As a result of that, methylene blue has a powerful effect on the mitochondria itself. And so what does that mean? Methylene blue enhances energy production in the mitochondria and also enhances detoxification capacity too. It is called a redox cycler, meaning it can donate electrons to the electron transport chain in the mitochondria, and this is how we make energy, or it can pick up free electrons anywhere, either in the mitochondria or in the cytosol itself, exactly like an antioxidant. And at higher doses of methylene blue, not only does it help as a direct antioxidant, it helps as an indirect antioxidant because it can increase what's called the NRF2 pathway, which increases the amount of glutathione that we make. And so not only does methylene blue enhance energy production and detoxification, it can compensate for mitochondrial dysfunction. Mitochondrial dysfunction is rampant now. 94% of US adults have some element of mitochondrial dysfunction. This means they can't either make energy effectively or they can't detox from the energy they make. There are a lot of things that go into making energy overall. You have to break down your macronutrients, specifically your carbohydrates and your fats, and you have to bring them into your cells, and you have to create what are called these intermediates of energy metabolism in your citric acid cycle. And then your citric acid cycle or your Krebs cycle, what it really is doing is breaking down those foods, those macros, into electrons. And then NAD and FAD become NADH and FADH and go into the electron transport chain in the mitochondria. They donate electrons to the electron transport chain, and then those electrons flow through. They make a gradient between the outer and the inner membrane of the mitochondria itself. And that gradient allows us to bring protons across that membrane to make energy. So that's the short story. So what methylene blue does is it can compensate for any aspect of the electron transport chain that's not working well. So if one of the complexes, there are four, complex 1, 2, 3, and 4, surprise, if any of them aren't working well, methylene blue can compensate for those, bypass them, recycle NAD and FAD if needed, and help continue to make energy, even if the mitochondria aren't very good at doing it. So that's a really cool and really awesome and something that I see all the time work clinically in practice. The other thing that methylene blue does, as mentioned, is it picks up free electrons. So when you make energy, ATP in our cells, which we make about 160 pounds of ATP every single day, what happens is we also make waste products, in quotes, of energy metabolism. That includes carbon dioxide, water, and reactive oxygen species. Carbon dioxide, not exactly a waste product, and that is something that's kind of a misnomer there, but it is something we breathe out. We have water, obviously. Reactive oxygen species are unpaired electrons that are signaling molecules in your mitochondria. Okay, and so as a result of all that, you have this amazing capacity, to signal the system, signal the mitochondria, know what so the mitochondria have a feedback system with the reactive oxygen species specifically. So what methylene blue can do is it can neutralize reactive oxygen species because many of us are antioxidant deficient. As a result of that, we cannot build or we cannot neutralize the oxidative stress, the reactive oxygen species that are happening. So to sum up, methylene blue initially was an antimicrobial, and we'll talk about now at the high doses of the dosing schedule for methylene blue. Then it became the compound that some antipsychotics were derived from because it has a monoamine oxidase inhibition capacity. From there, it became a laboratory stain, and now we know it's a fantastic mitochondrial optimizer. Okay, so now we've gone over a brief overview of methylene blue, what it does. One other thing I should say about methylene blue that also creates controversy is that methylene blue is synthetic. It was the first synthetic drug that was ever derived, that was ever made, and it was the first one that started the whole FDA, right? It was the first one that was approved by the FDA as a drug. First synthetic drug. Now, is synthetic always bad for you? That's the question I have, right? Because many of us think that just because something's synthetic, that we shouldn't take it. But the challenge with that as an overall umbrella treatise, let's call it, is that we live in a synthetic world. Right now, I'm currently traveling in San Francisco, seeing a very sick patient, somebody that's been a longtime friend. I am staying in a hotel room. The lighting isn't good, of course, although I have some sunlight coming in, the air, the water. We are around things that are synthetic all the time. So we don't always have the capacity to use something natural to work in a synthetic world. And we need synthetic things sometimes to help us. And methylene blue is one of those things. On the other side of things, not everything natural is good for us. You can go foraging for mushrooms, forage for the wrong mushrooms, end up in the ICU with liver failure and die. I saw this several times when I was in medical school, and this is not the only natural substance that's bad for us, okay? So it's really important for me as a physician to describe this to my patients because one of the things that I get a lot is, well, methylene blue is synthetic, so I don't want to take it. And I go, well, let's have this conversation about synthetic versus natural. And I understand. I grew up the son of a chiropractor, okay? And so everything was natural all the time when I was a kid. And until I was really into my teenage years in college, when my father really started to understand that there was a place for synthetic things sometimes, like going to the hospital if you need to go. We're fantastic at acute care. We're really good at trauma care. I trained in a trauma hospital. All very good, right? But we're really bad at preventative care. And in addition to that, it's not only that synthetic things are bad for you, that we need synthetic things sometimes to help us, especially for short periods of time. Okay, so now that we've kind of gone over that aspect, the synthetic versus the natural aspect of methylene blue, let's go over some of the controversy recently that's been floating in the socials, floating on the web. And so the first one I want to talk about today is blue brains. I really got a kick out of this article when it came out. And of course, it went pretty viral overall. And this is not terribly surprising. It was a fantastically clickbait focused headline where we're talking about using methylene blue and giving people blue brains. So the problem with this article is that, number one, it was an autopsy article. So it was giving you pictures of brains of people that had just died. And the problem with the people that had just died, they had died from very, very serious, very, very traumatic situations where they were given a ton of methylene blue, over 3 milligrams per kilogram. So if you want to equate that, if you're a 70 kilogram person, that's over 250 milligrams of methylene blue in the IV, okay? So IV methylene blue is obviously going to the system much faster than any oral versions of methylene blue. Side note, methylene blue is highly bioavailable no matter how you take it. So if you take methylene blue in the IV as a troche, if you swallow it, almost 100%. Outside of the IV, of course, 100% is going to get in, but almost 100% is going to get in if you take it orally as a troche or if you swallow it, okay? As a troche, it's going to be faster than if you swallow it. And if it's an IV, obviously it's going to be the fastest by far. Okay, back to the story here. So you have blue brains, okay? These patients got a huge amount of methylene blue. And then within a certain amount of time, a couple hours most of the time, they had an autopsy performed where their brains were blue. This is not surprising. This is, again, a huge amount of methylene blue that you would never be using in clinical practice. The doses that we typically use, as many of you know that are listening, are much, much lower than that. Most of the studies are around 1 milligram per kilogram. However, there are many more, and the clinical experience that we've had over the last 5 years that show that lower doses of methylene blue, 4, 8, 12, 16 milligrams, can be fantastically effective for mitochondrial optimization, for brain health, for overall inflammation as well. And so the doses that they were using in this study were just absolutely ridiculous when it comes to direct clinical care outside of severe emergencies. These patients were septic. They had cardiac arrest. They had severe infections. They were not doing well. This study was hysterical on some level in the sense that it was great for social media. If you showed these patients with, or these brains with this very blue color, that's not surprising if you're giving that high of a dose and you are doing an autopsy within 3 to 5 hours. Now, a question I sometimes get is, well, will my brain or will anything else turn blue at these lower doses? So obviously, if you're taking really any dose of methylene blue, usually about 8 milligrams or above, you are going to have some blue urine. Because methylene blue, what it does is it concentrates in the urine. And when you urinate, many of you know, your urine is going to be blue. If you've had a B vitamin, for example, you may have had you'll have some like neon green kind of urine too, and that happens as well. And that's okay. Like that's normal and that's totally okay. Now, may there be a small amount of time where you have some blue in your mitochondria? Yes, that's what we're trying to do. That's why when you use in chemistry class, when you use methylene blue and it turns those mitochondria blue for a couple minutes, it's because the methylene blue is concentrating there. But that's okay. In fact, methylene blue has 2 different states. It has a blue and it has what's called leucomethylene blue, so a colorless state. When it's blue, it means it's an oxidized conformation, meaning that it can pick up free electrons. When it's in leucomethylene blue or it has those electrons on it, it can donate those electrons. So methylene blue is always working back and forth between being blue and being colorless, being methylene blue and leucomethylene blue. So if there's any blue there, it's not going to stay for more than 4 to 6 hours because that's the half-life of oral methylene blue. So if you take it by mouth as a troche, if you take it and you swallow it, you're going to have methylene blue in the system, half-life for about 4 to 6 hours. This is also important too, half-life when it comes to methylene blue. Some people will talk about how methylene blue can build up in the system and you shouldn't take it every day. And this is not entirely wrong depending on your dose. If you're taking about less than 50 milligrams to 75 milligrams of methylene blue per day and you have normal kidneys, you should be able to excrete all of that methylene blue within about 24 hours. If you're taking above that amount, 75 to 100 milligrams, and especially above that, you will have methylene blue build up in the system over a longer period of time. So if you're taking a higher dose of methylene blue over about 50 milligrams a day, I typically recommend cycling on and off methylene blue. The higher the dose that you're taking, the more days that you're going to have to take days off of taking methylene blue. So in essence, what I typically recommend with my patients, if they're taking over about 30 milligrams just to be safe, I usually recommend them taking 1 day off per week. If they're taking above 50 milligrams, 2 days off per week. If they're taking above 70 to 100, 2 to 3 days off per week is about what I recommend. And so that's just a general gestalt, like a general overview. Everybody's going to be different depending on what they're using it for. For example, if you're using it for infection versus mitochondrial optimization. So next point I want to make is on the dosing. So we talked about the blue brains, right? And how ridiculous that whole thing was. And that's okay. Like that's That's what gets eyeballs on social. I totally understand it. I talked about in that study, they use 3 milligrams per kilogram. So what is the usual dosing that we're using for methylene blue? So in essence, mitochondrial optimization is anywhere from most people, anywhere as low as 2 milligrams to as high as maybe about 25 milligrams a day. And so some people will respond at very low doses, and some people will respond at the higher end of that level. Now, some people will need more than that, but I would say about 80-90% on average of the people that I've seen respond within that window if they have mitochondrial dysfunction. Okay. And so that usually is taken in the morning. Sometimes you can take an extra dose in the afternoon, like a BID dosing, typically 8 o'clock in the morning and maybe 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I usually don't recommend taking methylene blue too late in the day because it sometimes can cause people to feel more wakeful. It's not like a stimulant like you would be taking caffeine, for example, or nicotine, although nicotine is pretty short acting overall. But I do find that people do tolerate methylene blue better if they take it at 8 o'clock and about 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So mitochondrial optimization doses are very small. Most people out there are taking too much if they're looking to optimize their mitochondria. Okay. And I see this across the board on all the different products that are out there. Now, if you're looking for more significant mitochondrial support or for infection, acute stress, then around the 1 milligram per kilogram dose, that's about 70 milligrams, or 70 kilograms, about 150 pounds is on average right there. So about a 70 milligram dose-ish, that's the dose that we're typically seeing for this more acute stress. Now, if it's more an acute infection, I have been using even higher doses than that, sometimes up to about 2 milligrams per kilogram or about 150 milligrams for several days before ramping the dose down. But in general, for infection, you're talking about 50 to about 100 milligrams a day, but you're not typically staying on those doses for long periods of time unless you have a chronic infection and you're working very closely with a provider. These higher doses, as I mentioned, can build up in the system. They can require you to have to take days off, for example. I just recently spoke to a practitioner actually that was using 50 milligrams twice daily for people with acute or actually really more chronic GI infections, some parasites, bacterial overgrowth. He was using the GI effects by Genova, which is something that we use at Home Hope as well as part of the suite of tests that we use to help optimize our patients. And he was telling me that within about 5 to 7 days of this higher dose, he's able to get them to be free of these parasites, free of these infections. And there often is a detox period, like a Herx kind of thing that he has to support them through. He uses glutathione, activated charcoal. I use these in my clinical practice as well. And he's just seen a fantastic capacity to not have to have somebody on natural antimicrobials for 3-4 months, like berberine, oregano, uva ursi, and others. And he's just been floored with the capacity for methylene blue to do this. And actually has changed my practice. I'm going to start doing this as well. So that's an overview there on the dosing. You have the lower doses for mitochondrial optimization. You have the higher doses between a milligram per kilogram, a little bit more than that for more infection, sometimes even higher, up to 2 milligrams per kilogram might be possible depending on the situation. So from there, let's go to our good friend, Dr. Paul Saladino. And so Paul did a post a couple months ago now on methylene blue. And what he said is a couple things that are really, really important to dispel. The first one is he said that you should not take methylene blue if you have optimized mitochondria. And I think this is a really good point. As I mentioned earlier, though, 94% of the US population has some element of mitochondrial dysfunction. And I can promise you, people that have optimized mitochondria, those 6%, are living in hotel rooms sometimes. They're going on airplanes in the sky. They have stress at home. They're not sleeping well sometimes. So my sense is that almost everybody can benefit from being on methylene blue, at least at some point, okay? That doesn't mean every day. That can mean just as they need it, right? It may be something that just need a couple times a week, a couple times a month. I have a couple performance athletes that I work with. When they're doing high level endurance, they'll use methylene blue to help support them. If they're using hypoxic training, they found that methylene blue can be really helpful pre-hypoxia and then doing your exercise, your endurance afterwards as well. The key here to know is that not everybody should be taking it all the time. That is for sure. And as your mitochondria are getting more optimized, then you probably need less methylene blue over time as well. This is the key to how I practice with methylene blue. I often use it at these low doses. I titrate the dose over time to what's optimal for them. And then as we're optimizing their mitochondria, their vitamins, minerals, nutrients, and cofactors, from there, we're peeling off the methylene blue. So in some patients, they may need it for long periods of time if they have more significant mitochondrial stress and further to go. But in others, you can optimize the mitochondria using your typical protocols as a functional integrative practitioner, as a health optimization practitioner. And what you're going to see is that you're going to need less methylene blue over time. And the beautiful thing about methylene blue, really, from a clinical perspective, is that you can start it very early in patients while you're working on the hard stuff, their diet, their lifestyle, their behaviors, starting their supplementation. And as you're doing that, they start feeling better fast as you're titrating the methylene blue. So quick thing, side note on titration. What I typically do is I start off at a quarter troche, which is 4 milligrams, and I increase the dose every 3 to 5 days until I find the dose that's working best for them. That could mean that their mood is better only, or that can mean their mitochondria are working better, they have better energy, less inflammation, so many different things. So there's a little bit of a nuance in what that dose is optimally going to be. But once they find that dose, that's their dose. So either they stay on that regularly, or they use it as needed at that dose when they're doing things that stress their mitochondria. Okay, so the first thing to talk about here with Paul is that most people have mitochondrial dysfunction as described. Even those who do not always have mitochondria that are optimized. They're going to have times when they're more stressed. There's one study that Paul is really referring to here that showed in somebody with an acute stroke. This is not someone, this is an animal. If an acute stroke, what can happen is if you give a higher dose of methylene blue, around 2 milligrams per kilogram, you can rescue mitochondrial function in the area of the stroke. You decrease inflammation, you decrease hypoxic stress, you rescue brain tissue. So what they showed in this study is that if you use methylene blue very, very acutely, you could save tissue. On the other side of this, what they also showed is that in the normal brain, at these higher doses of methylene blue, this is around 2 milligrams per kilogram-ish, they found that there were some areas of the mitochondria in the normal tissue that got slightly dysfunctional. And this is not surprising to me, okay? Because most people have some element of detox capacity challenges. And what really is going on here is that at these higher doses of methylene blue, the way it's working as an anti-infective actually is by building up something called hydrogen peroxide in the system. Hydrogen peroxide is something you can buy over the counter at the store, but our cells make hydrogen peroxide to kill bugs. And when it does that, we can kill bacteria, fungus, virus. We do it all with hydrogen peroxide. This is why methylene blue has never been shown to have a resistance pattern to any bugs. Like bugs don't get resistant to it because it just makes more hydrogen peroxide. Okay. As a result of the hydrogen peroxide increase, what happens is the body has to respond by producing more antioxidants. Okay. And so those antioxidants specifically are via the NRF2 pathway, and that's making glutathione. So in these animals that they studied, they did not check glutathione levels ahead of time, of course. And when my sense is that when you give these very high doses of methylene blue to rescue mitochondria in the stroke area, which it absolutely did, you did cause some stress in the area that did not have enough antioxidant capacity. So what does this mean? This means that at higher doses of methylene blue, you want to be thinking about antioxidant capacity. This is why many people that are giving methylene blue at higher doses are also giving antioxidant support. And that's what I recommend. The other thing I want to mention about that stroke study is that the dysfunctional area of mitochondria that they talked about was temporary. It went back to normal. So there was not any long-term damage there at all. So that's the first thing that I want to talk about with Paul. The second thing I wanted to mention about with Paul is that he talked about how methylene blue is only working because it increases serotonin. This is absolutely ridiculous. Okay. Yes, methylene blue does increase serotonin. Yes, it's going to make people feel better overall. No doubt about it. Okay. Because it increases mood, but that's just a small part of what's happening, especially at these lower doses of methylene blue. At these lower doses of methylene blue, you're seeing mitochondrial optimization. You're seeing energy production enhancement. You're seeing detoxification. The problem with Paul and also Chris Masterjohn, PhD, who I'll talk about in a minute, is that these guys, they're not clinicians. Chris Masterjohn is a fantastic biochemist, but somehow he extends his biochemistry directly to patient care, which is not absolutely possible ever. A patient doesn't walk into your office and you can't look them up in a book. It just doesn't happen. A patient has multiple medical issues. They have multiple things going on. They have psychosocial issues. Chris and Paul do not see patients for a living. They are not physicians who see patients. Paul is a physician, doesn't practice. Chris is a PhD. He is not a physician. I have a lot of respect for Chris, especially. I think Paul, he practices what he preaches, and he lives in the Costa Rica. He does the carnivore thing, although he's changed over the years. So I respect them for what they do, but they do not do clinical care. And that's the big deal here, is that if you see patients, you see the nuances of how people react when you do different things. If you just look at a book or a biochemistry set of biochemistry things about pathways, etc., you're only going to see what's in the book. You're not going to know what's happening with the person right in front of you. This is what health optimization medicine actually is all about. We're giving tools to practitioners so they can work with patients and clients immediately right now and help them. As Dr. Ted likes to say, you have a patient in front of you, what the fuck are you going to do? And so that's really what it is all about at Health Optimization Medicine and Practice at Home Hope. And that's what is so important as a distinction between people like Chris Masterjohn, Paul Saladino, and others that are writing blogs on Methylene Blue and talking about it in various ways. Okay, so finally, just talk a little bit about Chris Masterjohn. Chris is a fantastic biochemist, as I said, not a clinician, and doesn't see patients for a living. I don't feel that he really truly understands the nuances of patient care. He wrote a great biochemistry treatise on Methylene Blue about a year ago, maybe longer, which is fantastic. But his conclusions, again, are not what I would say are optimal, because he's taking the biochemistry and extending this directly to patient care, which is not possible. So if you have an interest, go check out his biochemistry. It's fantastic. He did a recent post as well on how Methylene Blue should be used for travel, actually. And I appreciate him saying that. And clinically and personally, this works extremely well, because Methylene Blue works really well if you have less oxygen around. It can act just like oxygen in your cells and allow you to make more energy from oxygen or from aerobic respiration longer as a result. And this is why it's great for endurance athletes too. But if you're going to altitude, if you're on an airplane, you're at 8,000 feet pressurized, you have about 16% oxygen in the air compared to 21% oxygen at sea level. What Chris also says is this is a marginal change, but it's not at all marginal. If any of you have been on an airplane, one of the main reasons, I'm sure most of you have, one of the main reasons you feel crappy is because of the low oxygen level. If you come visit me in Colorado at 5,500 feet where I live, you're not going to feel good for the first couple of days. I promise you. And that's because of the altitude, because of the less oxygen in the air. So Methylene Blue can compensate for this. And on the Transcriptions website, we have a blog specifically dedicated to this. And I find it transformative. Everybody that comes to Colorado that visits me gets Methylene Blue when they get off the plane, hopefully before, if I can get it to them, so that they can benefit on the plane as well. Not only does it help with low oxygen, but it helps with inflammation. It helps with the radiation stress from being on an airplane. So I know this has been kind of like an overall just treatise on Methylene Blue. I hope it's been helpful for you. In the future, you're going to find videos on us doing Q&As, talking about specific questions regarding various controversies or various questions around how you can use Methylene Blue better or not. Maybe there's one more thing I should talk about. There was one more video by a lady, I can't remember her name, that was talking about how Methylene Blue is bad for fertility. And I've got a number of questions about this, so I'll finish with this one. There was a small study that showed that very high doses of Methylene Blue can cause stress on the sperm. Now, did you know that sperm and eggs have the highest number of mitochondria per cell? And so they're very sensitive to the stress that we have on our mitochondria. So very high doses can cause stress on the mitochondria. This is not surprising. Over about 2 to 3 milligrams per kilogram, this is going to cause stress on the mitochondria. We've already discussed this in various ways. And so should you be using those high doses if you are worried about your sperm and egg quality? The answer is absolutely not. Now, is there a possibility where you can use lower doses, 4, 8, 16, to optimize mitochondrial function and improve fertility? That is still an open question. But my true sense here is that it's certainly going to be possible. And I'm working with a couple of fertility doctors right now to look at ovarian aging before and after a course of 30 days of Methylene Blue to see if we do have a benefit overall. Thank you, all of you, for listening to this on Methylene Blue. It's my first solo episode. If you have any questions or comments or feedback for me, please let me know. This is something that I'd love to do more of. This is a topic that obviously I care a lot about and I talk a lot about. So thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Smarter Not Harder podcast, where we give you 1 cent solutions to $64,000 questions. You heard a lot from me today. I hope I didn't ramble too much or speak too fast. I tend to do that. But if you like this podcast, don't forget to like and subscribe below so you never miss an episode. We hope to see you next time on the Smarter Not Harder podcast. Take care.